Okay, so today's program, See, It Was Like This, and it's a memoir, an oral memoir of growing up in the 60s. And I see most of you have that experience from the 60s, but not exactly everybody, I assume, right? Yeah. Okay. And so I think, some of you will certainly relate to my own. This is one person's journey through the 60s. Just my story. And we all have stories to tell, and that's one of the things I emphasize with my memoir workshops, that we all have interesting stories. We've all lived through interesting times, no matter how old we are and that. And this is my story from the 1960s. And actually, I'm going to recite a poem first. The title, See, It Was Like This, that actually comes from a poem by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. That was the title of one of his poems. My program really has nothing to do with the poem, but I want to recite the poem just to honor Lawrence Ferlinghetti a little bit, since I took that title for the program from his poem. And this is his poem. It's from one of the best-selling poetry books in recent American history, Coney Island of the Mind. I don't know if anybody knows that book at all, but this is from that book, and it's called See, It Was Like This. See, it was like this when I waltz into this place, and a couple of Papish cats is doing an Aztec two-step, and I say, hey, Dad, let's split. But then this dame comes up behind me, see, and says, you and me could really exist. Wow, I says. Only the next morning, she has bad teeth and really hates poetry. That's Lawrence Ferlinghetti. See, it was like this. My program doesn't have anything to do with that, really, but that's Lawrence Ferlinghetti's poem. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, born in 1950. Working class Polish, family, Polish community in Buffalo, blue-collar factory. All the relatives worked at Chevy or Ford or Republic Steel or Bethlehem Steel or some other factory. And that's the environment I grew up in, very, fairly conservative in that. And, that time period, the parents lived through the Depression, they grew up during that time period. And, I was fortunate enough to grow up when I did in the 60s. And I want to start with a story that happened, an experience that happened when I was in 8th grade. And I went to a Catholic grade school. And it was in the afternoon, early afternoon, and the nun was speaking to us. She was standing in front of the class, and somebody knocked on the door. And a gentleman walked in. I didn't know who the gentleman was. I had never seen him. But he ended up walking up to the nun and whispered something in her ear. And she immediately, the sign of the cross and just this horror on her face. She didn't say anything to us at all. And she went to her desk and started writing something. And then she called me. She said, Michael, come here. And I got out of my seat and went up to her desk. And she handed me the note. And all she said was, the president has just been shot. Take this note to each of the classrooms. So I was the one who was the bearer of the bad news. 7 classrooms, 1st through 7th grade. I walk down the hall, knock on a door, walk in, hand the note to the nun. And again, the grief, the sign of the cross. And I did this 7 times. It was 5 nuns and 2 lay teachers. And boy, that has really stuck in my mind, that experience of being the bearer of bad news. And again, a Catholic school, John Kennedy being the first Catholic president even, just doubly horrifying for that reason. So I was the bearer of bad news. And it's interesting because the 60s, there was a lot of violence. I mean, if you look back on it, there was a lot of violence in that time period too. But it wasn't all violent. A couple of months later, 2.5 months later, another experience. And it was at the house instead of at school. And it was Sunday evening. It was Sunday evening on TV. And it was the Ed Sullivan Show. And the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, the first time showing up in America. And I remember, I was already a Dave Clark 5 fan. I don't know if anyone remembers the Dave Clark 5. I was already a Dave Clark 5 fan, but they hadn't been to America yet. And the Beatles were on, and I watched it because, it was big, it was something for the younger generation. And so I remember watching them, seeing them for the first time, and My parents didn't like them, of course, and my mom, I remember her saying after the show was over, "Oh, they're just a fad, they're not going to last long." You know, moms aren't always right, you know, they're not always right. But what I took away from that show was the hair. The hair, I mean, totally different than, you know, what we had been used to. And so the next morning, on my 3-block walk to school, I got my hair down on my forehead. And I had very curly, and more hair at least up there, and it was very curly, right? So I had to work on it on my way to school, but I got the hair down on the forehead. And I remember walking into class, and I looked around, and none of the other boys had combed their hair down. I was the only one. And I sat down, and it took the nun 2 minutes, just about 2 minutes. She noticed me, and she comes walking right up to me, pushes my hair back up on my head, and said, "Michael, wear your hair the way a boy's supposed to wear his hair." And, you know, some of the kids, you know, quiet chuckling, you know, and I felt a little embarrassed. And after lunch, we went outside. And I was a really good student. I was the best boy student, very well behaved and well mannered, and I always did what I was told. Well, when we went outside, before going back in, I pushed my hair back down again. Now I knew this is something she didn't want to happen, you know, didn't want me to wear it that way. So this was an act of rebellion. And I had never done this before. First time in my life I was really going against. And I walked back in the classroom, a little bit apprehensive this time. And I sat down, and she didn't notice me as quickly this time at all. It took a few minutes more. And then she suddenly looks and she sees my hair and just shook her head and tisked, and that was it. She didn't say anything. Rebellion worked. It's like, wow, my first act of rebellion. But on the way home, the hair went back up again. And I don't know if you can figure out why that was, but it was because of Dad. Because of Dad. I wasn't rebellious enough to go against him yet at that point. In fact, when I finally did a few months later, he saw me and saw my hair and said, "If you wear your hair like that again, it's getting cut off." And he would have done that too, I'm sure. So I wasn't that rebellious. I didn't want to go that far at all. But you know, when you look back on your life, you notice that there's some little experiences that happen. And you know, if this didn't occur, your life would be totally different. That you know your life would not be the way it's turned out. And something happened later in 8th grade. You know, again, it was a Catholic school, and the nun wanted me to go to Canisius High School in Buffalo, the best Catholic high school in the city. And I just didn't want to go to Catholic school anymore. And she tried to talk me into it. And then finally she got it, that I wasn't going to go to Canisius High School. I was going to go to Seneca Vocational. That's where all my friends were going. You know, and again, that was the way of the family. You know, you go to high school and you learn a trade and you get a job. And one day after school was being let out, she said, "Michael, come here, I want to talk to you." And so I went up to her desk, everyone else left. And she said, I understand you don't want to go to Canisius High School, okay. But she said, "Don't go to Seneca Vocational. If you go to Seneca Vocational, you'll learn a trade, you'll get a job, and that'll be it." She said, "You're smarter than that. You should go to Hutch Tech. It's the best public school in the city. And if you go to Hutch Tech, you'll end up going to college." And nobody was saying that to me. You know, I didn't even know where Hutch Tech was. And nobody was telling me that at all. And for some reason, though, what she said made sense. And I listened to her. And I found out where Hutch Tech was, and I applied to it because you had to apply to that high school. I didn't know anybody going there, didn't know where it was, but I applied to it. She made sense. And again, my parents weren't saying that. Nobody else was saying that to me. But for some reason, I didn't rebel this time against her. I listened to her. And I often wonder, where would I be if I had gone to Seneca Vocational School? I probably wouldn't be here right now, you know. It's that kind of thing that you know your life is different because of that. And Sister Claudine, that was her name, Sister Claudine. I thank her often when I think about that experience. Something else happened that summer then too. You know, this is 1964, summer of '64, between 8th grade and high school. And something more personal. And my parents used to argue a lot. I had two younger sisters at this point, 4 and 9 years younger than me. 2 more would be coming along shortly. And my parents used to argue a lot, big arguments. And one night they were out, they came home. This is the summer before starting high school. And they were in the kitchen just having one of their big arguments again. For the first time in my life, I got up to say something. I had never done that. I just always hoped they would stop and stay in my bedroom. And I got up this time, and I walked into the kitchen, and I just said, and I'm sure in a timid voice, I'm sure, but I looked at my dad, I said, "Dad, stop it." That was all. That's all I said. And I didn't know what was going to happen, whether I would get slugged or what. I didn't know. What happened was the furthest thing from my mind. He looked straight at me and said, "Don't ever call me your dad again." And they stopped arguing, so it worked. And I went back to bed, and I wondered, was that just because he was drunk, you know? Why did he say that? And it turned out the next morning we had a talk, and he wasn't my dad. He was my sister's dad. He wasn't my dad at all. And what it turned out is that, and I never knew my real dad then. He died already at that point. But I was what you would call now the product of an acquaintance rape. My mom was living with her girlfriend, a girlfriend's husband, and that's where I came from. And for some reason, you know, she married my stepdad, and they just kept it from me, you know. I don't know when they would have ever told me, but I found out in the middle of this argument, you know. And that was interesting because I didn't have a close relationship with him even then, and it certainly has never been since then. We coexist. He's still around, you know. We coexist. My mom died a couple of years ago. But one thing that was really clear in my memory, 2 days after that happened, I remember strongly thinking to myself, you know what? I'm the same person I was 3 days ago. This doesn't change who I am. I'm the same person I was 3 days ago. And that was a real revelation for me, and a way to get beyond that hurt from that, I think, you know. High school years in the 60s, wonderful time, wonderful time. And I've got one story from their English class, and I'm a poet. I've been writing poetry for 44 years. And junior year of high school, Mr. Kerr, my English teacher, we studied American literature that year, and you know, we read Farewell to Arms. I know that was one of the novels we read. We read short stories. Then we got to the poetry section, and I hadn't been into poetry at all. But, you know, we read Walt Whitman, Carl Sandburg, Vachel Lindsay. A lot of people don't recognize that name anymore. Robert Frost, obviously. And then my teacher gave us an assignment. He said, Monday, this was a Friday, he goes, Monday, I want you to bring in the lyrics to a song that you like. And let's see if that's poetry. Now that excited me because I was really into the lyrics of the songs of that time period, but I had a problem. What one song do I take in? I could have taken in, you know, 24 songs. And I finally narrowed it down. I'm curious if anybody knows who wrote this song. I'm going to say the title of it. Does anyone know who wrote it? The song I took in the lyrics to Masters of War. Anybody know whose song that is? Masters of War. Bob Dylan. It's a Bob Dylan song. And other people brought in, I know, Sounds of Silence, I Am a Rock, you know, Simon and Garfunkel, Nowhere Man by the Beatles. And for 3 days, we went over the lyrics to these songs. And that was real exciting for me. And then, Thursday it was that week, we came into class and Mr. Kerr said, I want you to write a poem today. You know, the whole class. That was our assignment in class, to write a poem. And I had never written a poem in my life. So I sat there, what do I write about? What do I write about? And finally I had an idea and I started writing. And I remember writing it, and I got to the last line, finished the poem, and I just looked at it, and just quietly I said to myself, wow, wow, I wrote a poem. And that was 40-something years ago, 44 years ago, and I haven't stopped since. And, you know, a few years after that, I tried to find that poem, that first poem, because I kept writing poetry. And I looked, you know, through old notebooks, looked at folded sheets of paper, you know, couldn't find it. I know what it was about. It was about Vietnam. You know, I was a junior in high school, 1967. And I know if I found it, who it would sound like. I'm sure it would sound just like Bob Dylan, you know. But I can't find it. It'll never show up now, I'm sure. Mr. Kerr, I'm totally indebted to him. A couple of my books have been dedicated to him even too. There's a wonderful story about him that doesn't fit this program, but I'd love to share it if anyone wants to hear it afterwards. So I went through high school, and one other experience was moving for me during that period. And it was June of 1968. And I wasn't old enough to vote yet. My birthday was, when was it that you could vote when you were 18? Was it that year? Later, 72 probably, or, you know, yeah, 71, so 72, the first presidential one, okay. So I couldn't vote that year, but I was following Bobby Kennedy's, you know, campaign, you know, and supported him even though I couldn't vote. And I remember staying up that June evening trying to get the results of the California primary. And it was too close to call. And you know, I had to go to sleep, I had to go to school in the morning. And I remember setting my little radio alarm clock right next to my bed for a little extra early that morning, just because I was anxious to hear what happened. And the radio came on, I woke up, and the very first words I heard was, "Now we'll go back to California for more news about Senator Kennedy." And of course, you know, we all know what happened there. And that to me was so much more traumatic even than John Kennedy's assassination for me. I mean, here I was, even though I couldn't vote, I was full of hope and enthusiasm for the process. And one of the things that happened for me then was I never voted. I think until Clinton finally was, you know, running. Well, why vote? I mean, I thought, why vote? This is what happens, you know. So that was, that'll stick with me a long time, Bobby Kennedy's death. So anyway, I wasn't going to go to college, but I got a scholarship, so I went to college, University of Buffalo, and we were talking earlier, and the school I went to, the high school, is a technical school, so I registered for calculus, chemistry, and Canadian history. That was a very practical course I was taking at that time while I took that course, Canadian history, and a journal writing class. And after 2 days of chemistry, I said, what am I doing here? And I dropped chemistry, you know, it's like, that's not where I want to be. And I wasn't real pleased with school, and I almost dropped out. That Thanksgiving period, you know, I was thinking, I don't think I'm going to register for next semester. Early November it was. And I had this journal writing class that a grad student taught. And we would hand in the journal every other week. And he would make comments in the journal. And I still have this one. And I was writing in the journal about how I don't think I'm going to come back here. I don't think I'm going to come to school next semester. And his reply was in pencil. And it was like, you know, you don't have to stay in school. You don't need to. But don't drop out of school into nothing. He said you should have something you want to do more than school. And if you have something you want to do more than school, it takes you away from school, perfectly fine. But don't just drop out into nothing. Have something you really want to do. And again, I read those words, and they made sense to me. And there wasn't anything else I wanted to do. So I thought, well, why don't I stay in school? But instead of, you know, I was taking calculus and that, instead of that, I registered for philosophy, political science, and history classes. And I stayed in school. And it was because of those words in pencil in my journal. And, you know, of course, this is the late 60s, 68, 69, 70. And UB, the University of Buffalo, is one of the radical places, the equivalent, I think, to UW-Madison at that time period, you know. And a lot of protests, a lot of, you know, police. At one point, 400 police moved in on campus and took over the gym and lived on campus for a month because of all the protesting going on there, all the demonstrations. I remember you'd be on campus and on the buildings, the police would be up there with rifles and cameras and binoculars. And just one protest, I remember we had the big the fountain right outside the student center, you know, the water fountain. Well, the water got turned off and the students brought a pig, a dead, real pig, and there was a pig roast in the fountain as the police were all up there in the buildings and that. And I know, like, one friend of mine said, yeah, rioting's fun, you know. But there was a seriousness behind it, though, too. And it was a strange backdrop to learning, you know, strange backdrop to trying to take classes. But what happened was, I think I took too many philosophy classes. And I got to my second semester of junior year, and at that point, my first semester junior year, I had a 3.5 average. That very first semester in school, when I almost quit, it was .857. And I got up to a 3.5 the first semester junior year. And we got to February of that next semester, and with all these philosophy classes, I had to ask myself, what am I doing here? And I still didn't have an answer. So I quit. But I knew what I wanted to do this time. I knew what it is I wanted to do. I wasn't going to drop out into nothing. I knew what I wanted to do, and I quit school in February, and at the very end of April, I bought a backpack, a tent, and a sleeping bag, and I went out on the road with my thumb. I knew that's what I wanted to do. The year before, I'd been camping with my Uncle Ed, who was like a father to me. He was an uncle who lived 4 doors away from me, and we were in the Adirondacks. And we took a ride down these dirt roads into this wilderness area. And for the first time in my life, this previous summer, I saw these signs. You know, Piseco Lake, 7.2 miles, Pillsbury Mountain, 5.8 miles, trail signs. You know, I was a city kid. I didn't know what they were. And I remember seeing them, and I said that summer, I'm coming back here to hike those trails. And so that next year, when I did quit school, I bought this equipment, I put my thumb out on the road, not knowing if I'm going to make it or not, and at the end of the day, I was right there in front of those signs that I was at the summer before, and I just thanked Uncle Ed, and I went off into the mountains. And that was the start of a period over 3 years where I hitchhiked about 30,000 miles off and on over 3 years, and totally changed my life. Totally. Out of all the experiences as a young adult, that was the one that shaped who I became later in life most out of all the experiences. And I don't know if any of you hitchhiked back in that time period or whatever, but it was just, I mean, this is what you did. You hitchhiked. And going in the mountains and backpacking, that first time I saw those signs, and I camped before the trail because it was near dark when I got there. Then the next morning I took off following those trail signs, following the trail markers. And the second night I was out, I was all alone in the woods. I've got my tent set up. I've got a little fire going, and you know, I'm sitting there eating, and I heard a sound. And what it was a tree falling in the woods. And I go, wow, that was a real tree falling in the real woods, and it made a sound, and I heard it, and this is so much better than any philosophy class I've ever been in. And to me, that was validation that I was doing the right thing, you know. And the thing that really was important for me, I was very quiet and shy. And when you hitchhike, you learn to talk to people. You know, you're in a car with somebody for, you know, 20 minutes, an hour, maybe hours, 5, 6 hours even. And you learn to relate to people and talk. And the other thing that was so important for me was everything I needed was on my back. Everything I needed to go away for a week or two in the mountains, I carried with me. And what a sense of liberation that was, that everything you need, you just have with you. You don't need much. Your food's there, then you could drink water from the streams in the mountains, you know, and what a confidence builder that was, to know I didn't need anything but what was on my back. And the hitchhiking, out of all those miles, 2 experiences that were negative. Out of all those 30,000 miles, one was getting picked up by an old guy in the Adirondacks, and as we went around curves, he would drive halfway in the other lane. And, you know, it's like, yeah, I said, you know, I waited till we could find a pullover. I said, yeah, I think I'm going to get out, thank you, though. I think, you know, and it's like, that was scary. And then one other time in Western New York, I was heading home. it was a day trip. I just had a little knapsack. And I'm standing there on the side of the road, a remote, you know, state road, and a car's coming, and just before it got to me, it swerved right at me. and I dove headfirst into the ditch, and they tore rubber and took off. And if I wasn't being aware, I was probably dead, But those are the only negative experiences. It was amazing that, over those 30,000 miles, a third of the time probably, I stayed in people's houses without ever asking anybody. People would just offer to put you up. It was just such a different world. Even now on my travels, one of my books, 20 Days on Route 20, it's the longest road in America, and that's from a journey in '96. I bartered for rooms. I traded books for motel rooms. And I do that now. I finished another journey this spring, the same one in spring this time, and I bartered for motel rooms and people's houses. I'll trade books for a place to stay. So it was amazing that what happened back in the hitchhiking days, people just offering, it's nice to be able to do that sort of in a similar way these many years later yet. But a couple of stories just from the hitchhiking days. And one, I remember I was in the Adirondacks, and I was in my tent. I had just been backpacking. I came down, and I had this sudden thought in the morning, I want to go see the coast of Maine. I didn't know anything about the coast of Maine, but just some thought. I want to go see the coast of Maine. So start heading that way. So I started hitchhiking and took my time through Vermont and New Hampshire. And I got into New Hampshire. I don't know if anyone knows New England much at all, but Route 2 is the northern route across. And I just got into New Hampshire. I went through there. I entered Maine. I got to Rumford, Maine, and that's the first time I smelled a paper mill. Boy, that's, that stays with you, definitely. And I got beyond Rumford, and this is my first year hitchhiking. And I stopped to get a little bite to eat at a diner. It was getting late in the day. And at this point, I was still either backpacking or camping like at campgrounds. I wasn't sleeping on the side of the road yet or just walking off into fields. And I'm finished eating, I'm looking at my map, and there was a state park about 20 miles ahead. And it's late in the day, and I said, oh, well, I'll go to there. So I paid for my food, and my backpack was out at the door. I left it there and inside, and I start walking towards it, and this guy and woman sitting at the counter, the guy stops me and goes, oh, where are you going? I said, well, I'm heading to Maine, somewhere on the coast, heading, to the coast somewhere. I didn't even know where, but he goes, well, tell you what, we're driving, well, I could get you to Bangor. We're going up north then, but I could get you a ride to Bangor. I'm driving a big truck, and he goes, I might as well offer you a ride. He goes, hell, I've passed you twice already today. Might as well give you a ride this time. And I don't know how that happened, but 2 different times. He wouldn't stop on the road, So this was my first time in a real truck. And, his wife was there, and he's driving, and I'm sitting on the sleeper bunk, bouncing away, feeling, now I'm a real traveler in the truck. And I got off in Bangor, and it was dark. And I didn't know where to stay. I didn't have much money at all, so I couldn't do a motel. And here I am in the city all of a sudden. And so I'm walking, it's about 9 o'clock at night, 9:30 or so. And I put my thumb out, and the car stops. And I throw the pack in and climb in the front seat. And he goes, where am I going? I said, I don't know. I just got into town. I was just going to grab a coffee and try to figure things out. He goes, well, I'll tell you what, you can stay at the house tonight. The kids are away at college. My wife won't mind. We got a lot of room. And where are you going? I said, I don't know. I just want to see the coast. He goes, well, in the morning, I'll put you on the road. One place to go if you want to see the coast of Maine. And he goes, the only reason I picked you up, 2 reasons, he said. One, you've got a really good backpack. He was a Boy Scout leader, so he thought I had a really great backpack. And you've got short hair. I think that was the last summer I had short hair, right? And he goes, you got short hair. So anyway, he took me home, had a great breakfast in the morning, and then he put me on the road. He drove me through Bangor, drove me through Brewer, put me on the road, said, you go straight for 20 miles, you'll get to Ellsworth, and keep going straight on Route 3, and you're going to come to Acadia National Park. You want to see the coast of Maine? That's where to see the coast of Maine, Acadia National Park. And I did. I followed his directions. And has anyone here ever been to Acadia National Park? Amazing place. And this was 40 years ago this year. And I remember getting there and seeing these mountains spread out on this island and sitting on the cliffs and watching the waves. And I knew I was home. It was a home to me in a different sense than Buffalo. And since then, 2 of my 3 kids have been born there. I've lived there about 7 years off and on, and it really has become my spiritual home. And it's because that guy telling me there's only one place to see the coast of Maine. And so I camped there and one other experience from the hitchhiking days. And again, one of those experiences that I know changed my life. And I was in the mountains. This was the second year, and I had been backpacking again. And I came out in Ticonderoga, the eastern side of the Adirondacks, by Lake Champlain and Lake George. And I was going to Boston. And my old girlfriend was going to school there. The first person I fell in love with. We had gone out for 2 years, you know, and I still wanted to be with her, and she wanted me to come visit her. And gee, if I go visit her at college in Boston, maybe we'll get back together again, you know. So I had all these hopes in that. And I'm standing on the side of the road, and there's black clouds coming my way, thunder and lightning and moving in my direction. I know I'm going to get drenched. And very few cars going by. And one car's coming by, and they pulled up, and I grabbed my backpack and I ran to the car and I threw it in the back seat and I climbed in the back seat, and it was a ride different than any ride I ever had before. It was two elderly women. You didn't get rides from seniors very often, and you didn't get rides from women very often. These were two senior women in the car. So they start driving, and the woman driver asked where I'm going. I said, anywhere to get out of the storm that's coming. So as we're driving, she said, well, we're going a few miles up the road, and a mile past where we would turn, there's a diner. I'll give you a ride to the diner. If it pours, you could run into the diner. So, okay. So as we're driving, the driver keeps asking me all these questions. Oh, what's your name? Where are you from? How long have you been traveling? Where have you gone? What do your parents think of this? Do you keep in touch with your mother, you know? And just all these questions. And then she, just before they got where they would have been turning, she turned to me and said, this might sound strange, Mike, but you're welcome to stay at our house if you want tonight. And I didn't even hesitate. Thought of those black clouds, the storm coming, and I said, I'd love to. So instead of going to the diner, we turned left and went along this road about a mile above the lower part of Lake Champlain. And the car we were in was a real rundown car. And as we got down the road, she pulled into a driveway into this farmhouse area. And it was an old rundown farmhouse, and this is where she lived. And we got out of the car, and she said, go upstairs, your bedroom's the one to the left, and supper's at 5:30, make sure you're down here for supper. And my son Bob, the youngest boy, he's a senior in high school, he's still home, he'll be back in about an hour, and you just make sure you're down here for supper. And I never learned her name other than Ma. She was Ma Stickney. I never learned her real first name, but everyone called her Ma. And the other woman in the car, she and her husband were staying with Ma and Ma's husband because their house burned down. They had no insurance and no money, so Ma took them in. And they came down, had a wonderful supper. A couple of hours after supper, two neighbors came over. And Ma brought out the gallon jar of homemade donuts, you know, and put them on the middle of the round oak table, put on a pot of coffee, and we all sat around the round oak table telling stories. Not everybody. I didn't have it. What did I know? You know, I was this, 19, 20-year-old kid. What stories did I have? You know, but they told stories about living in the country. Here I'm still a city boy from Buffalo. You know, they talked about, the deer they would shoot out of season and the fish they trap in the lake. And yeah, halfway up that mountain back there, during the Depression, there was a guy who lived in a cave year-round up on that mountain. Lived off of deer and wild animals and foraged food, lived there year-round in that cave. And they told these wonderful stories. It turned out I spent a week with Ma. I never made it to Boston, never went to see Margaret. We're still friends, though, which is great, still friends. But I stayed a whole week with Ma, and for the first time in my life, I helped out in the garden. And I picked eggs from the chickens, and I fed the pigs. And one day, Ma said, she gave me a gallon crock, the two-tone brown crocks, a gallon one. She said, Mike, go out and fill this up with dandelion blossoms. You know how much work that is, even when you're a young guy, picking a gallon's worth of dandelion blossoms? And another day, she said, yeah, Doc is up from New Jersey. He's got the house, he comes out on weekends, and he's the third house down, about a quarter of a mile, and he loves my elderberry wine. He says it's really medicinal. Can you go deliver this to him, And it was just, and they were poor people. Ma and her husband, they were very poor, didn't have much money, but what a wonderful heart they had. Kind, caring, generous people. And I ended up leaving there. I stayed a week, and I felt like I had to get moving. And I left there thinking, you know what? maybe I don't need to live in Buffalo. Maybe I don't need to be a city person. Maybe I don't need a lot of money. And maybe it doesn't matter what kind of car you have. Maybe what matters more is how you feel in your heart, how you relate to people. And maybe I could live in the country and have my own chickens and a garden. And I came away from that thinking that strongly. Never thought that before. And, you know, 2 years after the hitchhiking, I moved to the country. And I've been living in the country since. And it's because of Ma. Just stepping ahead, back about 18 years after that happened, it was late 80s, we were driving to Maine, and we were in the Adirondacks there. And I said, you know, let me see if I can find Ma's place. And I found the right road, I thought, and you know, there's the lake way down, and didn't see any house that looked like hers. Drove quite a ways, came back, and went a second time down the road. Nothing familiar. And then there's some people standing in a driveway, and I pulled in, and I went out, and I said, you know, I'm looking for someone's house that I stayed in a long time ago here. Ma Stickney, is that around here, her house? She said, oh, you're on the right road, but her house isn't here anymore. It burned down years ago. I said, was anyone hurt? She goes, no, not hurt, but Ma left, and she's living down in South Carolina with her son Bob. He was in the military, and I said, you know, how's she doing? Well, we hear she isn't doing very good, and we don't ever see her anymore. But every once in a while, her daughter would come up. I said, you know, would you mind if I leave a note with you? And if you see her daughter, give her this note. And I went to the car and I wrote a note, just thanking Ma. And I left the note with them. I never heard anything. Whether she ever received it or not, I don't know. But again, that's one of those experiences that you're indebted to this person. You know, as long as I live, I'm going to be indebted to Ma Stickney. You know, and again, one of my books is dedicated to her too. And that was the kind of thing. Those experiences, simple as they are, you know your life has changed. You know your life is different than what it would have been if you didn't have that experience. Just one other example about how many people hitchhiked back then. I hitchhiked all the way to Boston with a friend, Cindy and I, to see Tom Rush. I don't know if any of you know Tom Rush, the folk singer. He was playing in Boston. And then we're hitching back. It's a hot June day. And we got to Albany, where there's this big interchange of 90 and 87 and north and south, east, west, and just like a whole ton of toll booths and cars. And it's a hot afternoon, and we get left off there. And there's 30 people ahead of us waiting for rides with their thumbs out with signs, you know, 30 people. I think, oh, do we stand here? We don't even have cardboard, right? You know, it's like, and if someone stops, they could be going any of those directions, not just your direction. So we're thinking maybe we should get off the throughway and go on, you know, Route 20. And a car pulled up to use the phone booth. Remember phone booths? It's like, boy, they have disappeared, haven't they? And to use the phone booth before the toll booths, and it was a station wagon, and I saw you had cardboard in there. So I said, Cindy, when he comes out, maybe ask him if we could borrow some cardboard. And so he comes out, and she's talking to him, and all of a sudden she comes over, Mike, we've got to ride all the way to Buffalo. And that's like 290 miles, right? Wow, and he never picked up hitchhikers. And for some reason, you know, she said, we're going to Buffalo. He decided to give us a ride. And what was real intriguing, hitchhiking was therapy. When you get in a car and you talk with them. Half of the conversation, these 290 miles to Buffalo, was about his two daughters. One was a 15-year-old, the other one was 18 and moved out of the house, and she was living with a black guy. And she was white, you know, they were white. And he just, you know, I don't allow them to come to the house. I mean, what would this say to my younger daughter? And half of our conversation was about that dynamic, you know. We ended up getting to Buffalo, and this guy who never picked up hitchhikers, he goes, oh, too bad you live here, because I'd offer you to stay overnight at our house tonight and all that. And he was just so enthused. And I said, tell you what, pick up another hitchhiker sometime, you know. But that's what it was like. I mean, 30 people waiting for rides, you know, one afternoon, you know. But the hitchhiking, you know, eventually ended, and the next step was moving to the country, getting a community in the hills, and moving out of Buffalo. I got married and lived in Bliss, New York. It was real geography, Bliss, New York. We got an apartment in the country, a little house in the country in Bliss, New York. And you know, the day after we got married, there we were in Bliss. And unfortunately, it was one of those mistakes you make. It was Bliss only in geography. You know, the marriage didn't last. It was just one of those things. So it was Bliss, though, New York. But we ended up moving to the country. And I ended up talking with a number of friends, and we started a community in the hills, the Back to the Land community, you know, early 70s. And we bought some land, 85 acres of land for $10,000, you know, up at one of the hollows in southern New York, near Pennsylvania. And one of the people we met near there said, "Oh, you've moved to Appalachia." "Oh, no, this isn't Appalachia. Appalachia's down there." "Oh, no, this is Appalachia. You'll see." No, you know. Well, a couple of weeks after we were there, we were going around to try to find some old equipment. We need to put a road into the property, and maybe we could find an old bulldozer we could buy. And, you know, a lot of people out in the country have the old equipment out back. Well, this one house, there was a whole bunch of old equipment back there. We stop and go to the door and knock on it, and a woman peeks out, sticks out from the second floor window. Not at the door, from the second floor window. And she says, "What do you want?" "Well, we were interested, wondering if you might want to sell some of the equipment back there." And, "Well, I don't know. My husband's not home. And when he goes to work, he locks me in the house, so I can't show you anything." And we looked, and there was a padlock on the outside of the door that we hadn't noticed. We thought, Appalachia. We didn't go back there. We didn't go back there again. But it was really a very poor area of New York, and technically that is considered Appalachia, those southern counties in New York too. And Walter Kernan, the farmer down the road, couldn't believe we paid $10,000 for 80 acres of land. And boy, you paid that much for it? My gosh, you know. And he used to always kid around. He would put his fingers over his head. "When are you going to go get one of those wild cows, you know? Shoot one of those wild cows." And he would just have fun with that. And then there was Rags Dennis, another old timer who lived out a few miles away. One day we were standing in front of this old house that was run down. Nobody lived in it. And we were picking milkweed. Milkweeds, you can eat milkweed. We were picking the pods when they're really young. That's one of the parts of milkweed you can eat. And all of a sudden, there's this person standing right the other side of the milkweed, this grizzled old guy. "What might you boys be up to?" And we looked at him, and he lived in this house. Turns out his name was Rags Dennis, everyone called him. The windows were stuffed with rags. And he came from a rich family in the area, but he was the black sheep of the family. And he wasn't allowed in any of the bars, because once he drank, he got ugly, you know. And he said, "I'd rather shoot a man than a deer any day." So I was like, yeah, maybe we are in Appalachia here. But, you know, that got us to the country, though. And we had this community, and we were working on building a house there. And we learned what it was like to live in the country, you know, because we were all city kids. You know, and there were a lot of communities back at that time that got started. And most of them, probably 99% of them never lasted, you know. They didn't last. It seems like you have to have some real unifying principle to hold together. A lot of times it's religion or whatever, some common belief. And, you know, we just wanted some land in the country, and it never really took off. We built a cabin. We built a tent-sided cabin we were working on down after we put in a little road to the stream, and we had a big 400-foot hill on the property, and we built the cabin with logs from the woods up top, and we would haul them down, you know, tie a rope and start running down the hill and get out of the way, you know, and it was a wonderful experience outdoors, where again, I was a city person. Everyone there was a city person. And there were values that we learned from living simply like that. And I learned a lot about wild foods. We put in a garden, first time I ever had a garden. And again, that was the seeds of the whole rest of my life, you know, and this is partly what I learned from Ma Stickney and working with her garden and staying with other people after Ma when I was on the road hitchhiking who had gardens and lived simply in the country. And even though the community didn't last, you know, it lasted two years I was there, and then it sort of started falling apart. But it was valuable in the sense that it really got us to the country. And I've always been living in the country ever since. And, you know, those values from that time period, I think I've really tried to hold on to them as much as I can. And I want to finish with one story that happened from that community. And we were building that house. We were working on this tent-sided house. And it was November now. It was the end of November. And prior to that, we had been camping there, intense, you know, through the spring and summer and fall, and it was getting too cold, and we had some friends who lived about 7 miles away. They had a big house, so every evening we'd go to that house and stay there. And November 30th, that evening, my wife and I were sleeping in the bedroom in the bed, and a friend was sleeping on the floor in a sleeping bag on the floor in the same room. In the middle of the night, I hear him talking in his sleep, just mumbling. You know, I couldn't make out anything, but you know, he's talking in his sleep, mumbling. I'm listening, can't make out anything. Then all of a sudden, he stopped talking, but then as clear as a bell and loud, "Devil!" And then he's quiet. Now I'm totally wide awake. It's like, whoa, what was that about? In the morning, we were sitting up having breakfast, all of us. And I asked Tony, I said, "Do you remember talking in your sleep?" And he said, "No." "Remember anything about the devil?" "No, no." 10 minutes later, I got a phone call. And it was my mom. And it turned out in the middle of the night, Uncle Ed, who was like a father to me, died in his sleep. Totally unexpected. Totally a shock to everybody, sometime in the middle of the night. And he ended up having a blood clot in his brain and just died quickly. And, you know, it was just this total shock. And he was really that older male in my life that everyone should have, every young male should have, someone who I could always talk to and we could discuss. Even though we disagree, we could talk about it, and he was always there for me. And the sad thing was, he was one of the relatives, worked at Republic Steel, and he was 52 years old. And 2 years earlier, when he was 50, he had 30 years in, and he was going to maybe retire. And he came that close to retiring. But then he said, "You know, I'm young yet. If I work another 5 years, I'll get better benefits." And the night before he died, he had been out deer hunting. And that evening, when he came home, his best friend, Chet, who he had known for 40 years or so, came to visit. And they sat up in the living room talking about next year. Next year, my uncle had 13 weeks vacation. And they talked about where they were going to go fishing and camping. And he never woke up again, you know. And he could have retired 2 years prior to that. And who knows what would have happened, you know. And I wanted to end with that because, I mean, that was certainly a big happening in my life and very sad. But it was sort of the end of that time period too. You know, the community, you know, didn't continue much longer. But for me, you know, that Uncle Ed, he could have retired. And the thing is, I realized, you know, it's always there, hanging over our shoulder. You know, and already I think I was on a different path. I was on a different path than what was expected of me to begin with and what the usual path for the family was in that. And so I don't know that that necessarily shifted what I felt, but it certainly reinforced for me that, you know, maybe it's more important doing what you feel is important with your life and sticking with that and trying to live the kind of life, as Henry David Thoreau says, you know, live the life you have imagined. And you will meet with the success unequaled in common hours. And that's certainly one of those things that I think I learned from that time period and reading Henry David Thoreau in high school and thinking about the paths to take and the choices you make. And I feel fortunate to have grown up in that time period. And I know, again, you know, just a few of those experiences, my life would be different if I didn't react the way I did for those. And I think we all have those kinds of experiences that, you know, your life would be different if this was a little changed or that was changed. But also I think we all should value our lives and what we've lived through, and we all have interesting stories. So, you know, I hope you enjoyed this story. You know, it's one, you know, from that time period growing up, and again, some of you certainly have experienced that time period. And I think you have your own stories to tell too, and I think it's worth telling. One thing that's interesting, when I've done this program, a number of times I've had younger people come up to me maybe 20, I don't know how old you are, but you know, some people like in their late 20s, 30 years old would come up to me and say, you know, my parents are your generation, and they don't talk about it. And I learned more about that time period just from listening to you for this hour than I ever learned from my parents. And it's like, that's a shame, I think, you know, and you know, you hear all the, you know, if you remember the 60s, you know, blah, blah, you know, all this cliches about the 60s. I think it was a fascinating time, just like I think any time is fascinating. 70s, 80s, I don't know if I would have liked to have grown up in the 80s necessarily, but I think every time is fascinating, and we're all influenced by that time period. I'm glad I was influenced by the 60s, so hope you enjoyed this. And is there any questions? Does anyone have any questions at all? Any curiosities? Okay, well, yes.
How did you not wind up in the military?
Lottery, 138 my number was. And it was going to be close that year, but then they never quite got to that point at all. So yeah, it was the lottery. I mean, that's the kind of thing I tell younger people, that's the lottery you didn't want to win, you know. When they hear lottery, they don't think about what that was like. But yeah, it was just fortunate. You know, I was one of the fortunate ones that didn't, you know, get called. So.
What did you do for money?
For money, when I'd quit traveling for the seasons, I'd go back to work. The place I worked for was a big grocery store, supermarket. It was a precursor of Walmart. It was a chain in Western New York, a big department store, and they had their own grocery department within the department store, you know, a whole grocery store. And they'd let me leave every spring and hire me back at the beginning of winter. So I had this built-in job that I can go back to. And well, I loved it because every time I left in spring, we had a big party, you know. So I think that's why they hired me. Yeah, we'll have a big party in spring again. So I saved money. And then, you know, traveling, you didn't need a lot of money. I remember being, you know, up in Maine, 700 miles from home. I had $10 in my pocket. No big deal, you know. Got food in your backpack, and you got your thumb. And, you know, I spent 3.5 weeks with a friend, she and I, traveling around Nova Scotia. And we spent, like, I think $65, you know, 3.5 weeks. You know, it was a little different then. Yeah, but I worked. I was a hard worker otherwise, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you. And again, thank you, David, for bringing me here. And okay, thank you.